Hi everyone, this is John Mandrola from the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology, and I'm here at the ACC meeting in New Orleans with my friend Dr. Mintu Tarakia, who is a Stanford cardiologist and co-primary investigator of the Apple Heart study, which he just presented here to a packed audience. And Mintu, I'm really happy to have you.
John, thanks for having me back. It's always fun to talk with you.
The first question is, what is the Apple Heart study and what it is not? Is it an observational study, or is it a screening study, or a trial?
Great question. And so what the Apple Heart study is, it is a single-arm, open-label study of an intervention. We're not calling it an observational study because we did give an intervention, so it's not a Framingham-like study.
Okay.
But what it is that we wanted to assess an algorithm that was very carefully developed and really understand the key parameters around it, which I'm sure we'll get into. What is the notification rate or the burden? How well does the algorithm do? Is it safe? And what is the yield of AFib subsequently on a gold standard monitoring test? Those were really the aims. And so that is a very different kind of way of thinking than a traditional framework of a clinical trial for screening. We did not randomize.
Okay.
This was not a prescribed intervention of a therapy that a doctor or a public health service would do.
Okay.
And we're not really looking at differential outcomes, the hard outcomes that are very important to people. Instead, we wanted to evaluate this algorithm and its performance and safety in the real world in a way that people are going to interact with the technology they have.
Okay, the follow-up of that is, this is kind of a special study. I mean, is it a new way of doing clinical science? I mean, there's 420,000 people. Talk about the pragmatic nature of this.
Yeah, so as much as I am an AFib specialist and I'm so interested in the risk and outcomes and so many things you and I have spoken about before, the fact that there's a wide consumer base of these devices affords this really unusual and incredible opportunity to think about pragmatic design. And so when you want, and the other thing is scale, right? So how do you not only test a question pragmatically, but what about scale? And what do you need to do for scale regarding safety, study visits, making sure there's no emergencies when they're evaluated? And so in that end, we created this end-to-end virtual framework for this study. And that's, again, I think very exciting, and we hope that that provides a lot of information for the trial community.
All right, so there's nearly 420,000 people in the study. But when you analyze the outcomes, you analyze it on a small number. Talk about that.
Right, so which itself is a key finding of the study. So we enrolled 400,000 plus participants. Almost 25,000 of them were over 65 or over.
Okay,
right? And when you map that to US Census data overall, that is about 1 in 600 US adults, which I think is a striking number and one that we are, very proud of. The top finding is that the overall proportion that got notified was 0.5%. 99.5% did not get notified. So now you're dealing with a number of about 2,100 or so individuals who received a notification, and you have to follow them on. So there's a couple important points there. The first is the notification rate was low. That's very important. We can talk about that. Second is, as you're going to now tie this into thinking about trial design methodology, and we have to back calculate our power and the quantities and the number of e-patches we want, you have to make assumptions on engagement, overall notifications. And so even with that, you're whittled down to a small cohort, and that's the cohort from which you derive the study visits and the ECG patches.
Now, I know, was the 0.5% that were notified, was that of the total 420,000, or is that of the small over age 65 group?
No, that's the overall notification rate.
Okay, and then the second endpoint you were looking at, talk about that.
Right, so that was a technical outcome as a primary endpoint, and perhaps it's worth explaining the algorithm a little bit.
Yeah, please.
Because for clinicians, this is a very different way of thinking about atrial fibrillation detection. This is what I would call almost a probabilistic or an opportunistic approach.
Okay.
And so let's start with what we know. With insertable cardiac monitors, ambulatory ECG, pacemakers, we look for continuous recordings of discrete AFib episodes.
Right.
Now you take away the ECG, you look at the optical sensor. What we can measure is a tachygram. And a tachygram is a series of pulse timings between each other. So now what you want to do is one tachogram enough? Well, it turns out it's probably not based on what we know of how these work. And so what the algorithm will do is scan periodically when you are still, opportunistically at these times. And if it sees one tachogram that meets a regularity criteria, it then starts sampling more.
Okay.
If then 5 out of 6 meet irregularity criteria over a 48-hour period, a notification is flagged. So if you think about that, that's very different than single discrete episodes in the way we've thought of things. Now, the reason that we wanted performance endpoints around positive predictive value is at the tachogram level, we fundamentally wanted to understand the predictive value of the building block that forms the 5 out of 6. And so that's why that was as a first co-primary endpoint. The more clinically impactful endpoint is what did you see at the time it would have met notification criteria simultaneously. And so that was a secondary outcome, and that's what we looked at.
And how did that come out?
So the clinical notification concordance endpoint, so this is the group that had the ECG patch, and of those who had the simultaneous watch, so this is now all downstream of notification.
Okay.
We're now looking at the watch and the ECG data. We then have the data, we line them up, and we look to see when there are annotation markers flagged for when the algorithm would have met notification criteria. And so of those situations, the positive predictive value for AFib was 84%. So 84% of the time that it would have met notification criteria simultaneously, you had AFib.
What do you think about that?
So I think, one, we accomplished what we set out to do, which is what the boundaries are in characterizing the algorithm, and give some clinical insight and context about what we can do with that information. We think that that does provide substantial information to inform a diagnosis of AFib, and it does what it's supposed to. Now, we just finished collecting data on February 25th. We have a lot of other things we want to look at.
Right.
And one of those things is going to be to look at all other arrhythmias that could have occurred at that time.
Right. Now, one of the things that was mentioned in the presentation was how this will help clinicians. And I really wonder about that. I mean, what are your thoughts about how is this going to help clinicians, or what should clinicians do when patients got an irregular tachogram?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and the goal here was to understand the performance characteristics of the algorithm, which you know. And so now that you have that, what do we do? Well, I think you have to stick with fundamentally what we do as clinicians. You take a good history, you do a physical exam, you look at risk factors. But I can extend that further now and say, you know, at the time you received that notification, what was happening? What were you doing? How did you feel? And it adds a little bit of contextual information on top of the other risk factors. And so I think as a starting point, that's where we go.
Okay, couple questions almost done. You may not know because you're busy here today, but there's been a lot of hype. There's been a lot of mainstream media coverage, and I just, as a cardiologist and a researcher, I mean, just give me your feeling on that. What do you think about that?
So we, as investigators, come in with equipoise, and we are always circumspect with our findings. And this is a situation where we define our goals: algorithm performance, notification burden, safety, which we accomplished. We also recognize we need a lot more to do in terms of how this gets integrated into health and to have more clinical trials.
Right.
And what was so great to see was that that's happening, and that there are now randomized trials exploring these digital health tools in AFib disease management.
For instance, what are they? What can you give us any insight onto what's going on?
Well, so I'm not involved in them, but I'm just referring to the panel discussion that followed regarding the randomized trial.
Okay. That's good that there will be more trials. And finally, what is the future of this? I know you said there's more data coming, but does Apple plan more investigation into this, and what can we look for?
Well, so right now I am just focused on unpacking with this amazing team we have all this data for this Apple Heart study, and learning a lot more and asking key questions. What I found extraordinarily valuable to have the opportunity to present at ACC with my co-PI, Dr. Perez, is getting the extraordinary feedback on the things we could look. So I think that's still where we are for step one. We've had a fantastic collaboration with the sponsor, and it's been very enriching for us, and very enriching in the way we think of how to do trials forward with technology and engineering.
Excellent. Thank you for being here.
It's my
Appreciate
pleasure
it.
always.
All right.
Thanks.
Very good.